David Marshall Murdock spent more than 5 years behind bars waiting for his trial. The state of Florida decided to seek the death penalty against David because of the mitigating circumstances behind the murder of Lisa Bunce and the attempted murder of her best friend, Sanda Andrews. When trial finally came, David, against the advice of his attorney, decided to testify in his own defense. In a letter to his daughter, David said that there was no way to keep him off the stand because he felt like the jury needed to hear both sides to the story. He wanted to tell them about his childhood, and he wanted to tell them that Lisa mistreated him when they were together. David wrote that his attorney didn't think that it was a good idea for him to take the stand, and she warned him that she didn't think that he could handle the prosecutor during cross-examination. Turns out, David probably should have taken the advice of counsel, because during cross-examination, prosecutor Eric Johnson did not hold back. My name is Brandy Churchwell, and this is 13th Juror Podcast, where we unravel complex court cases and present them as compelling stories, breaking down the details and weighing the evidence from a non-legal perspective, just like the jurors do. Today, we are taking a look at the tragic murder of 56-year-old Lisa Bunce and the attempted murder of her best friend, Sanda Andrews, and the man who said that he had to do it to get rid of the devil, David Marshall Murdock. Part 3, Ripping the Wings Off an Angel. On cross-examination, the first thing that prosecutor Eric Johnson does is comment on how he was struck by what a wonderful memory David has. He said that he remembered in 2016, 8 years prior, that the night that he met Lisa, he came out of his house and ordered a Coors Light in a bottle. Very specific order for almost a decade prior. He remembers that he took Lisa to dinner on a Tuesday night and then on a Friday night 8 years ago. He remembers that Nick was 12 at the time that they met. He remembers one of the first houses that they looked at was a mobile home that was made in 1972, and they wanted $95,000 for it. He remembers getting to one house to look at it at 12:30, and the neighbor came out to talk to him. Johnson goes through detail after detail from David's story. Closing on the house May 12th of 2017. Sanda's community was 55 years and older. His was 50 and older. Nick's school was frostproof, and he started there when he was 14. They didn't rent a U-Haul truck, it was a Penske. But Johnson says where that good memory stops, according to David's testimony, is at right about the time that he went to bed on the Friday night before Lisa was killed, and Sanda was shot in the head. Just don't remember anything after that, he says. David says that's because that's when he went to sleep, and after that, he has no memory. Then Johnson begins to list things that happened during that time frame, asking David piece by piece if he's claiming that he doesn't remember these things. Like the text from Lynn at 12:15 saying, "Are you awake?" The call from Lynn at 12:19 where he spoke to Lynn for 3 minutes. David calling Tom at 12:39, then calling Sanda at 12:42, then calling Lynn back at 12:46 and talking to her for a minute and a half, telling her, "I can't believe she done that," referencing Lisa, then hanging up. David says that he has no knowledge of that call. He doesn't remember getting his flip-flops back on, getting in the truck with his keys, driving the half an hour to Haines City, calling Tom a second time while he was on the way, then calling Sanda again at 12:53, putting in the gate code at 1:08, pulling up directly to Sanda's, or firing those shots. Johnson says gunshots are loud. That didn't wake him up? David said he has no knowledge. Johnson plays the 911 call that David made for the jury. The dispatcher answers, asks for the address of the emergency. David said, "It's an emergency. I just shot 2 people at 373 Melbourne Drive." The operator tries to clarify. She says, "You just did?" He says, "Yes, I did. I had to get rid of the devil. I'm standing by the light. I'm not leaving. I'm sorry. I had to get rid of the devil." The operator asks who the victims were to him, and David just repeats the address and hangs up. Mr. Johnson asks David if that's his voice, and he says yes, and he points out that he was able to repeat the address not once, but twice. He then asks what medication it is that David's claiming he took that made him black out. David said that he took Celebrex and went to bed. Johnson then brings up David's state of mind at the time of the shooting. He says that the injunction that David filed against Lisa in October of 2018 was denied, and he said that didn't make him very happy. Here's the transcript from this exchange. Mr. Johnson, in October of 2018, isn't it true that the injunction that you filed against Lisa was denied?
Yes, it was.
All right, and that didn't make you very happy, did it?
Well, let me explain that.
No. You need to answer my question. That didn't make you very happy, did it?
It didn't bother me.
All right, so if you had written to Ron Nicoli, tried yesterday to get a restraining order on Lisa, the judge act like I was a criminal and she was a victim, he would not let me provide any evidence or nothing, and so we set up a trial date for December 14th. I was fucking pissed.
Well, yeah, I was.
Okay, well.
Because I'd asked for a temporary restraining order until the new court date, and he refused it.
Okay, my point and my question was, that didn't make you happy. And your answer was, let me explain. But I was fucking pissed was what you wrote to your friend on Facebook, not knowing that this would ever be anywhere in a courtroom, right? So you were unhappy. That was my question. Were you unhappy? David says that he was unhappy about the decision that the judge made. He was just mad at the judge. Mr. Johnson continues by bringing up another situation. He says in October, David tried to file charges against Lisa, and maybe even Sanda, for breaking into his house and cutting up a bunch of his stuff. This was David's response.
I did not try to file charges on Lisa or Sanda on that. I was asked when the deputies seen all my stuff cut up. The two women deputies says that was a woman that done that. Who's pissed off at you? And so I gave them Lisa's name. I did not give them Sanda's name. I just gave them Lisa's name. That was the only one I could think of. I did not say she come to the house, and I did not say that she cut up my property. I just said when they asked me who was pissed off at me, it was a woman that done that she was the only one I could think of at the time.
Okay, well, Mr. Murdock, isn't it true that it was you and your ex-wife that actually cut up the clothes and you tried to frame Lisa, pretending that I don't know who could have done this? But the bottom line is the police never charged anybody for it, did they?
No, they didn't.
Mr. Johnson said that was strike two. First, he lost the injunction. Lisa was never kicked out of the house because it was her house too. Now the police won't file charges against her. And they tried to frame her. He moves on to another day. This one in November. He says David lost the lawsuit for the $6,000 because the judge said that there wasn't evidence to prove that David loaned Lisa any money. Another loss to Lisa and another loss in litigation. Mr. Johnson then brings up Lisa not signing over the deed. He said that in August she didn't sign it over, in September she didn't, in October she didn't, in November she didn't, and here we are in December and she didn't sign it over again. David sends her a text and said that they need to have a face-to-face talk about it, and she refuses to meet up with him. Then Lynn catches David staring at Lisa on New Year's Eve, and their night is ruined. Then it just so happens that about 5 to 10 minutes before he leaves in his truck to drive to Haines City and shoot these two women, Lynn tells him that she got 32 texts from them and saw everything that he had been saying. David tells her, "I'm awake now. She shouldn't oughta done that," and then left to go murder Lisa and shoot Sanda. Finally, Mr. Johnson brings up texts that David sent to his ex-wife saying that he was the happiest man in the world because Lisa had tried to get a restraining order against him and the judge denied it. He tells her that's a big win because if she had been awarded the restraining order, David would have lost his concealed weapons permit because of domestic violence. So, on December 7th, David celebrated a victory, being able to keep his concealed weapons permit that allows him to carry the handgun that he would kill Lisa Bunce with less than 30 days later. David's attorney does a redirect after cross, and things go off the rails. Well, first, the attorney makes a point through questioning David that the restraining order that David tried to get against Lisa that was denied was only a temporary restraining order. But she says the judge did set a hearing date so that they could provide evidence for the judge to determine if he would approve the restraining order at that time. The injunction was dismissed because David didn't show up. I get that the attorney was trying to help David's case here, like the only reason it wasn't approved is because he didn't go. But All she did was point out that David obviously wasn't really quote-unquote scared of that woman because he didn't bother showing up for the injunction that would have protected him from her. Miss Tuomi asked David why he was scared of Lisa. He begins to ramble through a story about how Lisa invited him up to Ohio for Christmas because he had never experienced a white Christmas. Then he begins talking about his gun.
Since I'm a concealed weapon carrier, I carried my weapon with me, and I had it in its case in my suitcase. And when I got there, I took her upstairs and I showed her the weapon. I put a trigger lock on it. I popped the clip out. I put if you noticed in that one thing, that the long red with the cable, I slide that through the chamber, down through the grip, and lock it. Then I put it back in its case. I put another lock where the handle is, and I took it and I stuck it up in Lisa's closet up underneath some blankets. And then I took the ammo and separated it just so I let her know, since Nick was in the house, I did not want him getting a hold of the gun. And so I separated everything in there, and she said, "Thank you for doing that."
All right, so my question for you is, why are you scared?
So December the 26th, I'm not going to forget that night. The day after Christmas, Nick's done gone to his dad. He went over there Christmas Day. Nick was going to stay with his dad for the rest of Christmas holiday. Lisa and I are sitting at the dining room table, or at the kitchen table. She had a high-rise table. We're sitting there. She's drinking a Corona. She asked me if I'd drink with her. I said I didn't know. I don't really care for beer, but you've got some wine in there. I'll drink some wine with you. So I poured me up a small glass of wine, red wine. The phone rings. It's Nick. He tells Mama, "Look, Dad's at the bar. I'm not staying here. This is boring. I'm going over to Aunt Bonnie's," which is Lisa's sister. So Lisa tells him, "Call your dad. Let him know that you're going over there. Just don't get up and leave without him knowing." So they hang up. About 30 minutes after that conversation, Lisa asked me something that I never expected out of her. She says, she always called me baby. She goes, "Hey, baby." I says, "Yeah." She goes, "Do me a favor." I said, "Do you a favor?" She goes, "Yes." I said, "What is that?" She goes, "Loan me your gun." I think I said, "Excuse me?" She goes, "Loan me your gun." I said, "Why do you want my gun?" She goes, "Let me explain something to you." She goes, "Danny is worth more to me dead than he is alive." Says, "Loan me your gun." I'll go there about 2:30, 3 in the morning. Says the dogs won't bark at me, which I didn't even know they had dogs at that time. Says the dogs will not bark at me when I go in because they know me. I'll go upstairs, put 2 or 3 rounds in him, make sure he's dead. She goes, "I'll take your gun as soon as the night watchers close their curtains. I'll take your gun and your case, go by the Maumee River and throw it in the river, and they'll never know who the hell done it." I looked at her and I said, "Don't you ever ask me to loan you my gun again. You are not getting my gun." I says, "And you're not doing something that damn stupid." And I just got up and I went to the bedroom. She come up there about an hour later, and I told her I didn't want to discuss it, and so she didn't bring it up again.
Miss Tuomi asked David if that's the only reason that he's scared of Lisa. He says no, and she asks what else. Then this interaction happens. Here's from the transcripts.
I took a lot of abuse from her from that Thanksgiving weekend when she found that picture on my cell phone.
What picture?
My cell phone got a ring and I answered it, and it was Amber. I did not know Amber had my phone number.
Okay, what picture, Mr. Murdock?
There was a naked picture on my phone of another woman that worked on one of my jobs. We used to call her Water Girl. Her name was Valerie. We called her Water Girl because her job was to water the trees every day. In order to graft citrus trees, they got to be watered the day before. That way it keeps the sap up in them so you can graft them. So,
did Miss Bunce find that picture on your cell phone?
Yes, she did.
And what happened? How did she react?
When I walked back out and sat down, she was just sitting on the other side of the table, staring at that phone. She wasn't talking. So I really didn't pay much attention to it. She gets up, she comes around in front of me, and she's standing about 6 foot in front of me. She turns around and she goes, "What the fuck is this?" And I seen what she had found, and I told her, I said, "Let me explain what that is." And before I could explain, she reared back, she throwed the phone, hit me in the chest with it, right right across here in the crest. As I reach to grab the phone to keep it from hitting the floor, she starts punching me upside the head, slapping me in the face. I reached up, I grabbed her arms to stop her from hitting me. I stood up and I told her, "Look, do not hit me again. I'm going to turn you loose. I'm walking out that south door." I had two doors on my patio, one the north door and one the south door. I said, "I'm walking out that door. Do not follow me." So I walked out the door. I turn around, she's standing there. She hits me again in the chest, and I stopped her and I told her, "Quit hitting me." She goes, "If I had a knife, I'd rip your fucking heart out." And I told her then, "Look, as mad as you are, you're not staying at my house tonight. Call your girlfriend Sanda, come and get you and Nick out of my house. You're not staying in my house." When she pulled up, Lisa and Nick was in the house. I was out on the patio. Sanda pulls up, she looks at me and she goes, "What's going on?" I says, "I don't want to talk about it." I said, "Just get her the hell out of my house." I opened the door and I told her, I said, "Your girlfriend's here. Go." So when they loaded up, they had to go down and turn around and come back by. Well, when they loaded up, shut the doors, I went in the house, went to the bedroom, getting dressed for bed. I'm taking off my clothes, getting ready to put my pajamas on. Next thing I know, Lisa is standing at my bedroom door with the door open and she's looking at me. And I look at her and I said, "Look, I thought I asked you to leave." And she just stood there and stared at me for a minute. And then she shut the door and left.
This is the situation that Sanda had testified about when she said that David shot his gun in the house. David denies that. Miss Tomey is done, and Mr. Johnson gets back up to just ask one question. He says, "You're claiming that you're afraid of Lisa. She hit you, she threw a phone at you and slapped you and asked you to borrow your gun to kill her ex-husband. And after all of that, you didn't bother showing up for the injunction that may have protected you from her, correct?" David responds, "Absolutely." This time of year, every cat is an indoor cat. And when it's freezing outside, I am also an indoor human. And if there's one thing that can really stink up being stuck inside, it's a litter box. Don't let that nasty smell ruin your winter wonderland. Switch to Pretty Litter like we did. Pretty Litter's non-clumping formula traps odor and moisture. It's ultra absorbent, it's lightweight, low dust, and one 6-pound bag works for up to a month. And Pretty Litter gives me peace of mind. It changes color to indicate early signs of potential illnesses in my cat, like urinary tract infections, kidney issues, and more. Since Pretty Litter ships free right to my door, I never run out, I don't have huge kitty litter bags taking up space, and I don't have to go out in the cold and lug those huge tubs from a store to my car and into my house. The cat litter that we were using before had to be scooped out a lot more often. It wasn't as absorbent, it left a dusty mess, and it did not trap odor the way that Pretty Litter does. Plus, I tend to be one of those fur moms that worries a lot about what's going on with our pets, so having the color indicators to warn me of early signs of health problems gives me peace of mind and makes me a little less neurotic when it comes to the cats. Ollie, Scout, and Champ seem to love it. Indoor cats and indoor humans agree. Pretty Litter helps my house smell fresh and clean. Go to prettylitter.com/brandy to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. That's prettylitter.com/brandy to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. prettylitter.com/brandy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details. The defense does not call any other witnesses, only David. The state does a brief rebuttal where they call Dr. Stephen Nelson and Sergeant Alexander Tan to the stand. Dr. Nelson is the chief medical examiner and also a forensic toxicologist. Mr. Johnson says that there was testimony about the effects of medications making someone black out, and he asked to go through the list of medications that David was taking and asked the doctor about the side effects. Mr. Johnson lists the first medication, and Dr. Nelson explains what it's for, and Mr. Johnson asks, "Is that a medication that is associated with blacking out?" Dr. Nelson says no. He then asks about the Celebrex, which the doctor explains is an anti-inflammatory like ibuprofen, and An antiviral medication that was also listed is used to treat things like cold sores, herpes, and hepatitis. Neither of those are associated with any kind of blackouts. The other 3 medications are blood pressure medications, and the doctor explains that those are made to lower your blood pressure, so if you take too much, it could make you pass out. But you would be passed out, not blacked out, and not able to drive half an hour away. That wouldn't be possible because you would be unconscious. The only thing you could do would be breathe. The other rebuttal witness is Sergeant Tan, who was with David when he was in the interview room in the video that the defense attorney played during David's testimony. Sergeant Tan said that the posture that David had in the video, where he's sitting and kind of rocking back and forth very quietly, and that's the same kind of posture and mannerisms that he would do anytime that Sergeant Tan was around, or during court proceedings and things like that. But he said that there were a lot of times that Sergeant Tan would observe David without him knowing, whether it was watching his visitations or listening to jail calls. And when David didn't know that he was being watched, he was totally normal, articulate, and precise in what he was talking about. They play 2 calls to kind of demonstrate this. One is from 3 days after he's arrested, and the other is from the day after that. He talks about getting his medication, getting money on his books, getting his reading glasses, a list of emails, etc., etc. He says stuff about how he can't talk because of where he's at. Somebody says something about his Facebook, and he says he doesn't want to give that information over the phone to give the password, because if he does, then they could hear the password and get into his account. So he obviously is aware of his surroundings. Sergeant Tan confirms that during the time that David clearly knows what's going on and is thinking clearly, he was pretending to sit and rock when he was being observed by police. And with that, rebuttal is over, and it's time for closing arguments. The state presents their closing arguments, walking back through the evidence and discussing the elements that prove each count: the premeditation for the murder charge, the attempted murder elements, what burglary is, and shooting into a dwelling. The defense attorney, Ms. Tuomi, then gives her closing arguments. She argues that this is not premeditated murder because she says that there was no fully formed conscious intent to kill. She then paints David as the jilted lover and says that it defies common sense to think that David just got out of his truck and started shooting. She even brings up David claiming that Lisa got unpredictable when she drank. She continues her victim blaming by saying that Lisa was toying with Murdock and that she could have just signed over her name on the deed, but she didn't. The prosecution gets one more shot. He says something that is kind of a big point. When the police went to David's house to search it after the murder, there was an envelope on his bed with a phone number written on it. It was Sanda Andrews' phone number. David did not have that programmed in his phone. And he had Sanda written across the top of the envelope. The prosecutor says if he had this number on his bed with him, the number that he called and then called again when he was on the way, was he really even asleep? He then points out that David's testimony goes against everyone else's and most of the evidence that they've seen and heard. He warns the jury, beware the words of a desperate man. A jury of 11 women and 1 man deliberate for about 8 hours before coming back with a verdict. David Marshall Murdock is found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Lisa Bunce. He's also found guilty of armed burglary and shooting into a dwelling. The second count, attempted first-degree murder of Sanda Andrews, the jury found him guilty of a lesser offense. Instead of first degree, they found him guilty of second-degree attempted murder, meaning there was no premeditation that they felt was proven for the shots fired at Sanda. Having been found guilty, the trial enters the penalty phase. This is where the jury will hear arguments from each side, plus witness testimony and victim impact statements to decide if Murdock will be sentenced to death row or life in prison. The state's opening statement in the penalty part focuses on the brutality of the crime. He explains that the jury wouldn't be sentencing him to death for one crime or the other. It's specifically for the vicious, vile, wicked, and evil violence that didn't have to happen, but that the defendant took upon himself against 2 defenseless, unarmed ladies who were doing nothing but minding their own business, trying to live their life. The defense attorney for the penalty phase, Daniel Hernandez, argues that there are mitigating factors that should exclude Murdock from the death penalty, including the shooting happening when he was under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance, his impaired capacity to appreciate the criminality of his conduct beforehand to the requirements of the law, his history of extreme physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, which has caused him to suffer from his trauma in his entire life, and a long history of major mental illness, including multiple inpatient hospitalizations. Hernandez says that Murdock also has a history of instability in education. He repeatedly witnessed domestic violence as a child. He has no significant criminal history. He has been a steady worker and provider throughout his adulthood, despite his mental issues. He has advanced age with health problems. He has a loving relationship with his family and friends. And during incarceration, he says that he has been a model prisoner adjusting to life in prison. So each side argues how their case is supported by these factors. Now, the state calls Dr. Stephen Nelson back to the stand again. The prosecutor leads Dr. Nelson through a line of questioning about each of the bullet wounds that Lisa sustained and how painful each one would have been for Lisa, highlighting the brutality of what Murdock did and what Lisa would have had been experiencing at the time that he was doing this to her. Then the state allows for victim impact statements. Now, I've said it before, these are often the most difficult part of the trial, but also one of the most important. Lisa had a lot of people who loved her. She was a friend, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, and she was very active in the lives of her friends and family. There were 11 victim impact statements that were read on the record. The first up was Sanda. Sanda described Lisa as the ultimate mom. She had her own 3 biological children, and she also raised her grandchildren and a niece. Plus, she was a mother to her stepchildren and the hub of a very large, happy, blended family. Sanda says that the fact that she was shot at the same time that her best friend was murdered left her in a position where she didn't get to properly mourn. She didn't even get to go to Lisa's funeral. Sanda said it was really hard for her to sit during this trial and listen to the lies that Murdock and the defense told about the person that her friend was. She said that Lisa was a strong woman, a good person, had a heart of gold, loved to laugh, and loved the people around her. Sanda said that they have all had to manufacture a new world to live in. They're all slightly fractured, but still moving. But this new normal life is a shadow of what it used to be when they enjoyed the light and laughter of Lisa Bunce. In the transcript, a juror asked for tissues when Lisa finished her statement. Lisa's older sister, Bonnie, said that Lisa was the rock of the family. She was the one who stepped up when their brother was diagnosed with terminal illness, making sure that his final wishes were fulfilled and taking in his daughter and giving her a home. Nick, Sanda's grandson that she adopted and raised as her son, said that Lisa's murder has caused an internal pain in him that is just as hard today as it was 5 years ago. He's experienced anxiety, depression, and night terrors, and he carries a lasting trauma knowing what his mother endured in her final moments. Lisa's granddaughter Sierra described Lisa as a pillar of strength and a source of unwavering love, the life of the party at every family gathering. Statement after statement, family and friends described what an amazing light Lisa was to those around her. Her sense of humor, her deep devotion to her family and the people that she loved, the way that she made everyone around her feel important and special, and the infectious, bright spirit that shined from within her. In the final victim impact statement, Lisa's daughter Amber said that at her mother's funeral, you could see just how loved she was and how many lives she touched. She had people from all over the U.S. show up to pay their respects because she loved people and people loved her. Amber said it was so packed that it was standing room only, all the way into the lobby during her service. She was beautiful, kind-hearted, stubborn at times, but incredibly loved. Amber said that Lisa's brutal murder didn't just impact the family, it impacted an entire community. David Marshall Murdock was not getting rid of the devil. He ripped the wings off of an angel. The state rests, and it's the defense's turn to present their case. Murdock's sister Janet takes the stand. Janet describes some of the physical abuse that her brother experienced from their stepfather, Buddy, as a child. Janet said that David would have been about 3 years old when Buddy first entered the picture, and he was violent. He would abuse the kids, and if their mom defended them, then Buddy would abuse her. Janet said that they saw him knock her teeth out with a hammer one time, right in front of them. Janet describes a night when she was almost 15 that she was at a babysitting job, and her siblings told her a lot of stuff happened that night, and they were all going to leave and wanted to know if she wanted to go as well. She said yes. They went to their maternal grandmother's house thinking that she would help. The grandmother kept the oldest son, but apparently didn't want the younger 3. She took them to the police station and basically said whatever happens to them happens. The kids ended up in different foster homes for about a year. David's son, David Jr., and his daughter, Althea, both testified during the penalty phase as well. David Jr. and Althea came from 2 different marriages. David Jr. from Murdock's second marriage and Althea from his third. Both marriages ended when each of the children were young, so David had a visitation schedule of every other weekend. Each of his kids said that he would take them to do things like bowling and fishing, and that he was always a hard worker. David's daughter also says that her father has told her about how he struggles to sleep because he fights the demons. They come in his sleep, and that's when he has issues with it. Both of his children say that they became aware later in their lives of the abuse that their dad suffered as a child. Next up, Dr. Eisenstein, a licensed clinical psychologist with a subspecialty in forensic neuropsychology. Now, Dr. Eisenstein saw Murdock over 6 sessions at the Frostproof Correctional Center, a total of about 25 hours of face-to-face evaluation and interview. He also did an extensive review of his records and interviewed some of Murdock's family members. Now, I gave a brief overview of David's history in the previous episode. His dad was committed to a psychiatric hospital when David was an infant for setting fire to their home while they were all in it. His mom remarried after that, and the stepfather was physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive to David and his sisters. Chaotic and violent home life, a year in foster care when he was 12 and 13, and then David dropped out of school at 16 and started working. Now, Dr. Eisenhower outlines this history in much more detail when he's testifying. Then the doctor says that he spoke to David's mother, and his mother says that his relationship with Lisa was toxic. She said that David didn't smoke or drink, especially since he only had 1 kidney, but she said that when he got with Lisa, he started drinking and smoking again. She also said that Lisa had, quote, inappropriate behavior, including provocative sexual behavior, end quote, according to the doctor. Now, she told the doctor also that her son was trying to control things, and at the end, he just exploded. The relationship between David and his mom is something that's kind of interesting to me. In emails to his brother and his daughter, David talks about things that his mom said to him about how she didn't want him and how she never cared about him. But then he asks his brother if he can convince her to come to the trial. His brother said that she didn't want to come there because she didn't want to see him in that situation, but she said she would come visit him in prison. This upsets David. He says that he needs to see her to show up and see her face to face so that he can know if she really loves him or if she hates him. He says that he loves her as a mother, but as a person, he says, quote unquote, hell no, because she put them all in the worst possible childhood that they could ever have. He says if she doesn't come to see him in court, he won't put her on the visitation list in prison. Now, the doctor also talks about David's medical history. Different times that he said that he suffered head injuries, starting at age 4, when David told him that he remembered getting punched in the left eye by his stepfather, and he remembered seeing stars. There were about 7 or 8 head injuries that the doctor listed off. Multiple severe head injuries can cause brain damage that results in abnormal brain functioning. But the prosecutor points out on cross-examination that there's no record of any of those head injuries. They basically have to be just kind of believing David that it all happened. And there's not much evidence to support that they happened because in 2016, David had an MRI done that showed everything was normal. No regions of decreased diffusivity in the brain. So that kind of goes against that whole argument. Then we get into the devil and monster references. Now, this was kind of interesting. The doctor says that Murdock referred to the devil or the monster on numerous occasions during their sessions. He says that Murdock told him that he had his first psychiatric hospitalization when he was 17 years old. He said that he vividly described a fight with the devil, an out-of-body experience, and thoughts of suicide. He was taken to the hospital and held down by 8 staff members and then placed in restraints and hospitalized for 10 days. A few years later, at age 23, David said he was married with a baby on the way, and he would wake up hearing the monster telling him to hurt someone and kill himself. David said it disturbed him to the point that he would walk all night and come home at daylight. He said he walked to Winter Haven Hospital emergency and was admitted for a few days. Dr. Eisenhower said that David had another hospitalization 4 years later for the same thing, the monster telling him to hurt someone else and himself. He refused medication, and when he left, he went to the Catholic Church and asked for an exorcism, but was told that they don't do those anymore. They just recommended that he pray to God. At 29, he said that David walked for hours and then called a friend who picked him up and tried to take him to the hospital, but David refused. In his early 30s, he began walking in graveyards because he said that he couldn't hurt anyone there and he couldn't hear the devil there. David says his marriage to Teresa ended because he loved her and he was afraid that he would hurt her when the monster was controlling him. Teresa's story of why their marriage ended, however, was very different. According to her, Murdock wanted to be a swinger, and she wasn't interested in that lifestyle. On top of that, much like the head injuries, none of these hospitalizations have any kind of records to corroborate them, just David saying it happened. In the medical records that they do have, it actually shows that every time he was seen for anything, it was marked on his records that he was negative for any kind of psychiatric symptoms. No unusual anxiety or evidence of depression. The patient denied hallucinations and does not have suicidal ideation. There are a lot of appointments that he had in those records, and for each one, he's listed as normal mood, normal insight and judgment, absence of depression and anxiety. The only time that anything is actually reported is in January of 2017, when David went to the Bond Clinic and said that he was experiencing depression symptoms and lack of pleasure in life. The report said that he had no history of ongoing depression. He was at baseline just 1 month prior. But 5 months later, David was back and he reported feeling much better. Also, on his application to purchase his firearm and have his concealed carry permit, they ask if you've ever been in a mental hospital, educated mentally defective, or been committed in a mental institution, and David checked no. Murdock was sent to a psychiatric hospital under the Baker Act after he was arrested. Now, he refused to take his medication, and he was ordered antipsychotic medication injections against his will. It was here that he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, PTSD, and depression. The PTSD is from the abuse as a child, and the doctor says that the trauma affects him in a way that still experiences it as if it's fresh all these years later. The schizophrenia affects less than 1% of the population. You can hear voices, see things that aren't there, become paranoid, extremely suspicious, to the point that it kind of takes over your entire functioning. But there's some questions that are brought up by this as well. Schizophrenia starts in late teens and early 20s. And there's so much testimony about how David was a hard worker and high functioning and did all of these productive things. That would be really difficult with unmedicated schizophrenia. It's somewhat questionable that it would take 40 years and a capital murder case for it to be diagnosed. The doctor also mentions the suicide attempt that David mentioned in his letter to the judge, where he tried to hang himself with 4 socks, but was found conscious by a staff member and treated. Now, during that time, there were periods where Murdock would isolate, and it was described as almost catatonic, writing notes but not really communicating any other way. The doctor said that this was his way of controlling the monster and not letting it take over. The doctor then described some of the testing that he did on Murdock. The first is a test to try to determine if he is faking or being disingenuous, and he said that the score on that was in normal limits. They then measured his IQ, which was average, and they moved into the executive functioning tests, which gauge the performance of the frontal lobe, which is responsible for managing and guiding cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functions. So it's basically kind of like the computer that runs each of us. Now, the doctor said that David had trouble when tasks become too complex, thinking through difficult situations and coming up with reasonable judgments. That's the thing he has the most difficulty with. The doctor concluded that his opinion is that Murdock's behavior was consistent with acting under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance at the time of the crime, and previous head injuries could have caused brain impairment. But during cross, the prosecutor brings up that in January of 2020, the facility that Murdock was in found that he was feigning symptoms of psychosis, noting that his current and past symptoms of mental illness have not been typical, and they did some testing and determined that he was trying to portray himself as more symptomatic. Basically, he's faking it. 8 months later, the same facility did more testing and determined that he was feigning the hallucinations about demons. And when he was released from the facility that fall and sent to the jail, his report specified that he was intentionally producing false or grossly exaggerated symptoms, motivated by external incentives. So that's the last of the witnesses. Or so we thought. Unable to sit around quietly, David Marshall Murdock decides that he wants to take the stand one more time. He has a lot more to say. David Murdock takes the stand for the second time. He is emotional during his testimony. He cries multiple times and gives details of his childhood to the jury that he's hoping will spare him his life. He starts by detailing some of the abuse that he suffered as a child. He tells a story about being 4 years old and using a book of matches that belonged to his mother to light some newspapers on fire in the back room of their home. His mom comes in with a water hose and puts out the fire, and he says that the fire department comes. All of the burnt debris is thrown in the yard, and when his stepfather gets home and sees it, David's mom tells him what happened. David said that his stepfather waited until his mom left to go to the grocery store to get something to make for dinner. Then he came in and grabbed him by the arm and punched him in the eye. When David's mom gets home, he said that he heard Buddy telling her that David fell when he was jumping on his bed and is going to end up with a black eye. His mom came in to tell him that he needs to stop jumping on the bed, and David said that he wanted to tell her that Buddy was lying, but he couldn't because Buddy was standing in the doorway behind her. David said that Buddy started sexually abusing him when he was 6 years old, and he gives explicit detail about the first time that it happened. He says he also witnessed his sisters being taken into the bedroom at different times for the same reason, but he didn't know why until it had happened to him. David said that Buddy told him that if he told anyone about it, he would make his mother disappear and he would never see her again. David said that when his older brother Charles caught Buddy sexually assaulting one of their sisters, the four of them decided to run away. They had plans to go to their grandmother's house, and they spoke up about the abuse that had been happening in the home. David says that Buddy ended up in court, and his sister Janet testified against him, and then his other sister Donna. David said that he had just turned 13, and the judge decided that he was too young to testify. But he was in the courtroom, he says. He said that when they finished testifying, then Buddy's defense attorney called their first witness, and it was his mother. Here's a reading of the transcript where David is telling this story.
My mother gets on the stand, and his attorney asks my mother, "Can you tell me and the courts why your kids are saying what they're saying?" And my mother sat up there, and she said right on that stand, she goes, "Let me tell you something." She goes, "Ever since me and my husband's been together, my kids has done nothing but try to break us apart." And I'm sitting there, and I'm listening to this. She goes, "My kids are lying." She goes, "They're spoiled, rotten brats." She goes, "My kids have never been alone with him to do what they're saying he done." Bullshit, Mom. You had 5 more kids, or 4 more kids after you got with this man, and every time you was in the hospital, he was taking my sister Janet, and he was taking my sister Donna to his bedroom. If he wasn't taking them, he was taking me. And so she goes, "My kids are spoiled, rotten brats because they're lying. He's never been alone with them." And just upon that testimony, they let him walk out of that courtroom. I couldn't believe she done that. Because when she got on that stand, I was saying, yeah, my mother's going to put this piece of shit away for the rest of his life. But when she sat there and said what she said, I didn't know what to say anymore. When she walked out of that courtroom, she wouldn't even look at me. She just looked away. And that was the first day I started hating my mother.
David said that they were in foster care for about a year, but then returned to the home. When they were sent back, his sister wouldn't go. She had a ride waiting on her to take her somewhere else away from Buddy. David said that he didn't see her again for years. He also said that there was often no food in the home, and there were times that his dad would throw the food in the backyard and tell them that if they wanted to eat, they could go eat like the dogs. The prosecutor then asked David if he has anything he would like to say to Sanda. He addresses Sanda directly.
I never ever wanted to harm you in any way whatsoever. I'm sorry for the pain and the suffering that you have been through. I never intended for you or anybody that night to get hurt or lose their life. The only witness I have is God, and I know, come Judgment Day, I will have to answer to Him. I pray every day to God to ease your pain and to let you have peace in your mind and heart.
He then addresses Lisa's family.
To the family and friends of Lisa Bunce, I don't know what to say to ease your pain and your heartache, except that I am sorry for your loss. The children, the grandchildren, the nieces and nephews, the sisters and brothers, I apologize. Not from the bottom of my heart, but from all of my heart. I don't own the hand of time. If I did, I would turn it back to that night and this nightmare would have never happened. I do believe if I ask you for forgiveness, that would be selfish of me. I will leave that in your hearts and hope one day that the pain in your heart will ease and you can go on in your life with peace. There's not one day that I don't pray to God for Lisa, for I know that come Judgment Day, I will have to answer to God and He will do what is right in His eyes.
It's time for cross-examination, and it's brief, but it is fiery. Mr. Johnson has the photos of Lisa's autopsy on the projector, showing the extent of the damage from the bullet wounds. He's angry. He comes out with a raised voice. The raised voice turns to shouting, and Murdock tries to speak over him. Mr. Johnson, where was this mercy on January 5th of 2019 when you gunned down 2 innocent people in their home?
I've gunned down nobody knowingly.
Where was it?
Nobody knowingly did I gun down.
I noticed you didn't look at any of this when you were on the stand. Look at it. You did that. And you won't look at it because you know you were wrong. We all sat and listened to you for the last half an hour talk about everything bad that happened to you. You did that. And everything you just testified to is an excuse. It's all about you. Look at it. Pick your head up. Look. You can't look at it, can you? Because you know right from wrong. You knew exactly what you did wrong, and you called 911 to tell them what you did.
I have no knowledge of that night.
And that's why
I have no knowledge of that night.
You can remember every detail of your life for the last 61 years, including who picked you up.
You ever have a stepfather at 6 years old rape your ass? No.
Are you asking...
And I don't forget about it.
The judge intervenes here, telling Mr. Murdock to wait for the question instead of talking over the attorney. Mr. Johnson, my question is, you can remember every detail for the last 61 years, whether it was the bottle of beer that you drank the night you met Lisa, or the color of the lady from DCF that came that was blonde, driving a car, but you blacked out and conveniently missed the entire part of this case that you're in here for. That's not remorse, it's an excuse.
No, it's not an excuse, it's the truth. I have no knowledge of that night.
Look at her.
I will not look at something that you want me to look at.
Why not?
Because I can't remember it, and I'm not going to look at it.
Okay, maybe this'll jog your memory. He throws the pictures down right in front of David and says no further questions. The following day, closing arguments are done from each side, recapping their arguments and explaining the mitigating factors to the jury. They must come to a unanimous decision on at least one of the 4 aggravating factors in order to recommend a death sentence. After about 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury comes back with their decision. They unanimously voted yes to 2 of them, but no to the other 2. They recommend to the judge life in prison without the possibility of parole. A sentencing date was set for April 19th. Murdock, who had been dressed in a suit for trial, was brought in for sentencing in April in his Polk County Orange Department of Corrections clothing. Before the judge handed down the sentence, Sanda was given an opportunity to speak. She told Murdock that he was insecure, pathetic, manipulative, and a liar. Sanda said, quote, "It's disgusting that the devil that you wanted to kill was inside of you, and you were too chicken to kill that one," end quote. Sanda was relieved to finally put the trial behind her, and was thankful that she would no longer have to see David. She felt comfort knowing that she was leaving the courtroom with her freedom to live life, and he was not. Sanda said, quote, "Today is the last day I will have to put up with you breathing my air," end quote. The judge gives Murdock an opportunity to speak, but for the first time, he declines. The judge follows the jury's recommendation and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David has already filed an appeal for the conviction of the murder charge. His new home is Martin Correctional Institution, about 100 miles southeast of the home that he shared with Lisa for that short time. Sanda has tried to move forward with her life. She still spends time with friends and family. She got married, and she still lives in the home in Sweetwater. Lisa's family gets together still for Thanksgiving, but they say it's not the same. They don't get together for Christmas as a big family anymore, and there are no Christmas cookie decorating parties for the grandkids. The annual camping trip is too difficult without Lisa, so that's also a thing of the past. Lisa spent her life loving others and organizing trips and celebrations to ensure that everyone was making incredible, happy memories. And while it's hard for her loved ones to live without her, they're thankful for those memories, especially now that those are all they have left. My name is Brandy Churchwell, creator of 13th Juror Podcast. If you're enjoying it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And share this episode with your friends. It's the best way to spread the word about these cases and helps others find us. For more information, photos, and episode guides, visit our website at 13thjurorpodcast.com.